G'day, and welcome back to the Backyard Traveller. Today we are in Port Adelaide, visiting the National Railway Museum, also known as the Port Dock Railway Museum, one of South Australia's most fascinating collections of railway history. Now, you don't need to be a train enthusiast to enjoy a place like this. Railways help shape Australia, connecting cities, towns, industries, and communities across enormous distances. Every locomotive, carriage, and station display here tells a small part of that story. So, let's head inside and spend a few hours exploring some of the highlights. This old departure board once stood in Adelaide railway station. Before digital displays, railway staff manually updated boards like this throughout the day. Countless travellers would have stood beneath it checking departure times, saying goodbye to family members, or setting off on holidays and adventures. It's a simple display, but one packed with memories. Now we come to one of the museum's oldest treasures, Locomotive G1. There's something special about seeing one of the early locomotives that helped establish rail transport in South Australia. Standing beside it, you get a real appreciation for how railways transformed communities, opening up travel and trade opportunities that simply weren't possible before. Moving inside, we get a look at the kitchen facilities associated with the G1 train. It's surprisingly compact, especially when you remember that meals were prepared here while the train was moving. Railway staff had to work in tight spaces and often under challenging conditions, all while keeping passengers fed on long journeys. The dining and lounge cars provide a glimpse into the more comfortable side of railway travel. Passengers could enjoy meals, conversations, and scenic views while travelling across the country. Compared to today's fast-paced travel, there was something much more relaxed about the railway experience. One display that always draws a crowd is the model railway. The level of detail is incredible. Tiny trains, miniature buildings, carefully recreated landscapes and working signals all combine to create a fascinating little world. It's one of those exhibits that's impossible to walk past without stopping for a closer look. One of the most atmospheric exhibits in the museum is the recreation of Wynbring Station. Wynbring was located on the Trans-Australian Railway and sat in an incredibly remote part of the country. The station wasn't just a place where trains stopped, it was home. People lived and worked here, often hundreds of kilometres from major population centres. The museum has recreated elements of daily life, including the waiting room, cafeteria, and workers' accommodation. Walking through this display gives you an appreciation for the resilience of the people who worked these remote railways. Now it's time for something a little more interactive. The train simulator lets visitors experience life from the driver's seat of an Adelaide metro train. It quickly becomes clear that operating a train involves a lot more concentration and precision than many people realise. Nearby is a classic railway crossing signal. Signals like these have been helping keep roads and railways safely separated for generations. They're a familiar part of everyday life, but they also represent an important part of railway safety. One of the most interesting parts of the museum is seeing the equipment that kept railways operating behind the scenes. The control room, signal room, and station master's office all reveal how much coordination was required to keep trains running safely and on time. The large mechanical signal levers are particularly impressive. Before modern computers and electronics, railway staff physically controlled signals and points using systems like these. It's a reminder that railways relied just as much on skilled people as they did on locomotives. As we continue exploring the museum, we arrive at one of the most uniquely Australian stories in railway history, the tea and sugar train. Now, if you've never heard of it before, the name sounds almost whimsical. It could easily be mistaken for a children's story or a tourist train, but the reality is far more interesting. The tea and sugar train operated along the Trans-Australian Railway, stretching across the vast emptiness of the Nullarbor Plain. Beginning in 1917, it served remote railway settlements scattered along the line. These settlements existed because the railway needed workers to maintain the track. Families lived there, children grew up there, and entire communities formed in places that would otherwise have been completely isolated. The problem was that many of these settlements had no shops, no banks, no medical facilities, and often no reliable road access. So, the railway brought the town to them. The tea and sugar train carried groceries, fresh produce, household goods, medical supplies, banking services, mail, and even travelling doctors and dentists. For many residents, the arrival of the train was the biggest event of the week. Standing here beside SAR Carriage 3 and the Baroota Carriage, it's easy to appreciate how railway travel became increasingly comfortable as the years went by. Travelling by train was still a relatively new experience. Journeys that once took days by horse and coach could suddenly be completed in a matter of hours. Carriages like this carried generations of South Australians to work, holidays, family visits, and important life events. Together, these two carriages offer a glimpse into a time when trains were at the heart of everyday life, linking communities across the state and creating memories for countless travellers along the way. Making our way through this part of the museum, locomotives 97, 253, 409 and 702 provide a fascinating snapshot of how steam power evolved across South Australia's railway network. Locomotive 97 takes us back to the earlier days of rail travel, when steam engines were helping open up the state and connect communities that were previously difficult to reach. These locomotives were the workhorses of their era, hauling passengers, freight, and mail across a growing railway system. Nearby, Locomotive 253 reflects a period when railways were becoming increasingly important to everyday life and industry. As towns grew and freight volumes increased, rail operators needed locomotives that were more capable and more reliable, and engines like this helped meet that demand. Standing beside Locomotive 409, it's impossible not to notice the sheer size and presence of the machine. By this stage, steam locomotive design had advanced considerably, allowing trains to haul heavier loads and operate more efficiently over longer distances. Then we come to the impressive 702. Built when steam technology was approaching its peak, the 700 class locomotives combined power, speed, and modern engineering. For many enthusiasts, they represent the golden age of South Australian steam railways before diesel locomotives gradually took over. Together, these 4 locomotives tell the story of decades of railway progress, each one building upon the achievements of the generation that came before it. One of the highlights of the museum is this wonderful collection of exhibits dedicated to the Overland, one of Australia's most famous passenger trains. For well over a century, the Overland has connected Adelaide and Melbourne, carrying generations of travellers between the two cities. Long before budget airlines and modern freeways, this was one of the great ways to travel interstate. For many people, the journey itself was just as memorable as the destination. Walking through this section of the museum feels a little like stepping back into that golden age of rail travel. Starting here on the reconstructed platform, it's easy to imagine passengers arriving with suitcases in hand, farewelling family members, or preparing for the long journey ahead. Railway stations were often bustling places, full of anticipation, excitement, and sometimes a few tears as loved ones said goodbye. The beautifully preserved carriages help bring those memories back to life. Carriages such as Onkaparinga and Alambai showcase a time when railway companies placed enormous importance on passenger comfort. Looking around at the timber panelling, fittings and furnishings, you can see that travelling by train was designed to be an enjoyable experience. Passengers weren't simply transported from one city to another, they were looked after throughout the journey. One thing that's easy to forget today is just how social train travel once was. People spent hours together in lounge cars, dining cars, and compartments, sharing stories and meeting fellow travellers from all walks of life. Lifelong friendships were formed on these journeys, and no doubt a few romances as well. The detailed Overland models on display help tie the whole story together, showing how the complete train would have appeared in service. Seeing the club cars, economy cars, and sleeper cars assembled as a full consist gives a real sense of the scale and prestige of the train. One of the more unexpected displays in the museum is the collection of railway engines, including a Rolls-Royce diesel. Most people hear the name Rolls-Royce and immediately think of luxury cars. But the company has been involved in engineering projects across numerous industries, including aviation, marine applications, and railways. Standing here beside steam locomotive 752, it's hard not to be impressed by both its size and presence. Built as part of South Australia's famous 700 class locomotives, engines like this represented the peak of steam locomotive development in the state. When the 700 class entered service during the 1930s, they were among the most powerful locomotives operating on the South Australian Railways network. Designed to haul heavy passenger and freight trains, they became a familiar sight across much of the state, tackling demanding routes and helping keep people and goods moving efficiently. What makes locomotives like 752 particularly interesting is that they arrived during a period when steam technology had been refined over decades. Engineers had learned how to extract more power, improve reliability, and make these machines more capable than ever before. Moving on, we come across Locomotive 93 and Carriage 41, two exhibits that help tell the story of everyday railway operations in South Australia. Locomotive 93 dates from an era when steam power was the driving force behind the railway network. While it may not be as large as some of the later locomotives in the collection, engines like this played an essential role in moving passengers and freight across the state. Alongside it is Carriage 41, a reminder that the railway experience wasn't just about the locomotive at the front. For most travellers, the carriage was where the journey happened. Whether people were commuting, heading away on holiday, visiting family, or travelling for work, carriages like this carried countless passengers over many decades. One of the most fascinating exhibits in the museum is the travelling post office carriage. Today, if we need to send a message, we pull out a phone and send it instantly. But for much of Australia's history, mail was the lifeline connecting people across vast distances. Railways revolutionised postal services. What makes this carriage particularly interesting is that postal workers didn't simply transport mail. They sorted it while the train was moving. At first glance, the grey boxcar might not seem particularly exciting. There's no polished brass, no passenger accommodation, no dramatic steam locomotive attached. But freight wagons like this quietly helped build Australia. Everything from food and clothing to machinery and building materials travelled in wagons like these. Moving on, we encounter the Tom Bar Smith locomotive. Tom Bar Smith was one of South Australia's most prominent philanthropists and businessmen, and his name remains associated with many institutions throughout the state. Naming locomotives after notable figures was once common practice. It gave locomotives individual identities and created a stronger connection between railways and the communities they served. It's interesting how a simple nameplate can add personality to a machine. Instead of being just another locomotive, it becomes part of a larger story. Another of my favourite displays in the entire museum is actually one of the simplest. Along the wall is a collection of station signs, locomotive number plates, and name boards. Every station sign represents a real place. Every number plate belonged to a locomotive with its own working life. Every nameplate tells a story. You can almost imagine how many journeys began and ended beneath these signs. Heading outside, the museum suddenly feels much bigger. The collection spreads out across the yard, and everywhere you look there's another locomotive, carriage, wagon, or piece of railway equipment waiting to be explored. Indoors, you see individual exhibits. Outside, you begin to appreciate the sheer size of the railway industry. One of the more modern exhibits is Carriage 2006 from Adelaide's 2000 class railcars. For many South Australians, this train probably feels far more familiar than some of the older exhibits we've seen today. These railcars served Adelaide commuters for decades and became part of everyday life. That's one of the wonderful things about museums. History doesn't always have to be ancient. Sometimes it's recent enough that visitors remember it themselves. Nearby is a collection of maintenance vehicles that reveal another side of railway operations. An enormous amount of behind-the-scenes work is required to keep a railway functioning safely. While passengers rarely notice them, railway workers relied on them constantly. It's another reminder that railways are much more than trains alone. Locomotive 523 carries the name Essington Lewis. Lewis was one of Australia's most influential industrial leaders and played a major role in the development of Australian manufacturing. Naming locomotives after significant figures helped create a connection between railways and the wider story of the nation. Rather than simply being machines, locomotives became symbols of achievement, industry, and progress. This is a very South Australian exhibit. The Farmers Union boxcar immediately brings to mind one of the state's most recognisable brands. Before modern logistics networks, railways were responsible for transporting enormous quantities of food and agricultural products. The 930 class locomotives became a familiar sight across South Australia from the 1950s onwards. Built during the transition from steam to diesel power, they helped modernise railway operations by offering greater reliability, lower maintenance costs, and improved efficiency. For decades, locomotives like 930 hauled freight and passenger services across the state, becoming one of the most recognisable diesel locomotive classes in South Australian railway history. Nearby is the West End boxcar, a reminder of how closely railways were linked to local businesses and industries. One of the highlights of the entire museum experience is climbing aboard the Heritage train ride. There's something special about actually travelling on railway history rather than simply looking at it. As the train rolls away, the museum suddenly comes alive. The sights, sounds, and movement all combine to create an experience that's impossible to replicate in a static display. We depart from Callington Station, a beautifully recreated piece of railway history. Then there are some familiar faces from the collection. The little red Shunter 515. The streamlined Bluebird railcar. And perhaps most beloved of all, the famous Red Hens. For generations of South Australians, red hens were part of everyday life. They served suburban and regional routes for decades and remain among the most fondly remembered trains in the state's history. Back on foot, we continue exploring with GM2. The GM class played a major role on the Trans-Australian Railway and became famous for operating across vast stretches of the continent. These locomotives helped demonstrate the advantages of diesel power on long-distance routes. The HF Jerry Walsh locomotive adds another personal story to the collection. Throughout the museum, it's impossible not to notice how many individuals contributed to Australia's railway heritage. Engineers, drivers, industrial leaders, maintenance workers, station masters. The railway story isn't just about machines, it's about people. The BHP Locomotive No. 4 highlights the close relationship between railways and heavy industry. Mining companies, steelworks, and manufacturers relied heavily on rail transport. Without railways, many of Australia's largest industrial developments simply wouldn't have been possible. Carriage 7558 may not be the most famous exhibit in the museum, but it contributes another piece to the larger puzzle. Every preserved vehicle helps tell the story of how railways evolved. Together, they create a remarkably complete picture of Australia's railway heritage. When I arrived this morning, I expected to see some interesting locomotives and historic carriages, and there have certainly been plenty of those. What I enjoyed most about the National Railway Museum wasn't any single locomotive or carriage. It was the way all the exhibits come together to tell a much larger story. A story about travel. A story about industry. A story about communities connected across enormous distances. And above all, a story about the people who built, operated, and relied on Australia's railways. Whether you're a railway enthusiast or simply curious about an important part of Australian history, there's something here that will capture your interest. Thanks for joining me on today's wander through the National Railway Museum here in Port Adelaide. Until then, safe travels.